This is Epicenter on KWMR, West Marin Community Radio. You can hear Epicenter Monday through Wednesday at 5 p.m., stream recent audio archives on our homepage, kwmr.org, and now you can catch the rebroadcast Tuesday through Thursday mornings at 5 a.m. Well, I'm your host, Jeff Manson, and today I'm happy to welcome back on the KWMR airwaves Andrew Standley, who worked for more than 30 years for the European Union, serving as EU Ambassador to Bolivia, Israel, and Mexico. He will be appearing at the next fireside chat put on by Music and Minds, the wonderful folks who have been hosting all kinds of events up on the Inverness Ridge. That's coming up Friday, May the 9th, and he'll be speaking about what's next for the U.S. EU alliance. So, welcome to the KWMR Airwaves, Andrew Standley. Thank you for being here.
It's a real pleasure to be with you, Jeff. Thank you.
I'd love to touch a little bit on your storied and esteemed career here to start by I was thinking about the fact that you represented the EU in Israel, Bolivia, and Mexico, which seem to be three very different political environments. And I wonder how those experiences shaped your understanding of transatlantic diplomacy, generally speaking.
No, very good question. I hadn't really thought about it in terms of the transatlantic relationship, but in fact, the three countries I served in, I think, have very close links in terms of the EU-US relationship. Bolivia and Mexico, obviously both in the Western Hemisphere, zones that traditionally have had a great deal of US influence. And then Israel, obviously a country that has a particular geopolitical importance and a particularly close alliance with the US, as well as a very strong relationship with the European Union. So I think in all three of those countries, one of the things that I was looking at was the impact of domestic politics in those three countries in terms not only of the relationship with the European Union, but also with the United States. And in Bolivia was a particularly interesting time to be there. It was when there was a big political revolution taking place with the election of Evo Morales as the first indigenous president in Bolivia's history, and a marked change in terms of the relationship between that country and the United States. Mexico is obviously a country where US politics dominates Mexican politics as much as sometimes Mexican politics intervenes in US politics. Mm-hmm. And then Israel, but I don't think I need to comment any longer on at greater length on in terms of the importance of that relationship between the US and Israel. But yeah, but I think this also goes to highlight the fact that the EU-US relationship is not only important in terms of its bilateral nature, the direct connections between the US and the EU, but also all around the world, other countries, their relationships with the US, that's also important for the European Union.
Right, of course. Big question to start with, I suppose. I'm curious about, are there some lessons from your postings that feel applicable to this moment now, a moment of political disruption, I'd say, or transition, such as we are experiencing with Trump's early presidency here?
Yeah, and I think that's also a key issue. One of the things which has been quite striking to me in terms of how the EU has been responding so far to the latest developments in Washington is the constant emphasis on the desire to try and find a solution through a negotiation, not to deepen the conflict, not to engage in further retaliatory moves, even though the the European Union has prepared its own retaliation, whose implementation has been suspended also. And the European Union, from what I can see, is anxious not to get to the point where those retaliatory measures have to be implemented. So one of the key lessons is the need for negotiation to try and find a diplomatic agreed solution. The European Union and the US for many years tried to negotiate something called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Treaty, to really formalize the very close relationships that exist in economic terms between the US and the European Union. Unfortunately, that never came to a final agreement. But the urge on the EU's part, at least, to find a negotiated solution is paramount. And I think, in a way, it matches what we're hearing out of Washington. I mean, President Trump has made it very clear that he is imposing these tariffs, but he wants to find a negotiated outcome, not only with the European Union, but with the US's other trading partners. And so I think everybody has to hope that somehow this desire that exists on both sides of the Atlantic to negotiate a solution, that should be able to come about.
Yeah. Well said. So this event that you'll be attending and speaking at on Friday, the 9th of May, is going to roughly coincide with the first 100 days of Trump's presidency. We're sort of looking at the shape of EU-US relations in light of those 100 days. And without going blow by blow necessarily, what were some of the first immediate signals to folks such as yourself, other European diplomats as well, that this transatlantic alliance is entering uncharted waters?
Well, I think the signals were already there even before the inauguration. I mean, I think what President Trump is doing now is what he had announced loudly and clear that he intended to do during the campaign. But it's also true that the world that the European Union sees around it now is a very, very different world from the world 100 days ago. The basic structures, let's look at the international trade as maybe the foremost issue that dominates the agenda at the moment. The rules-based international trading system that existed up to, let's say, 100 days ago, with the World Trade Organization at its center, with a certain predictability and certain mechanisms for trying to lower or raise tariffs in certain circumstances, that system seems to have been pushed aside. And that was a system that the European Union really relied upon a great deal. So the possibility that that system has been dismantled and may be replaced or may not be replaced by something different is of grave concern to the European Union. But also the general system of alliances, and obviously the question mark that now hangs a little bit over NATO as a result of the whole crisis in Ukraine because of the Russian war and the invasion of Ukraine. That's also, I think, deeply troubling to the European Union. But even as a committed European, I have to recognize that Europe needed to be shaken up on the security front. Europe had been taking advantage of the US's security umbrella for too long, had been under investing in its own defense. Even before President Trump's first term, even President Obama had been calling for Europe to spend more, but those calls from the US certainly became much clearer under President Trump the first time, and even more so now. And I think there's a general consensus in Europe that that is a fair criticism that's been leveled at the European Union over the past few years. The challenge for the European Union is how to respond to that in a way that's relatively quick and affordable. As always, the question is, where does the money come from for Europe to spend more on its own defense?
Yeah. And you and I have spoken on this radio station before about the rise of autocratic, we can say, certainly nationalist governance in the EU. In the context of that swing happening here in the United States, do you feel is the EU emerging stronger or more fragmented, would you say, in the response to the Trump administration's, these early provocations?
Well, I think this is a wonderful opportunity for the European Union to emerge stronger. And there's a lot of people who see that in this crisis that the European Union is now having to face, both economic, trading, and also security, that there is a great opportunity for decision to be taken that will allow the European Union to emerge as a more confident and as a more significant global player. Because there's a real concern now in the European Union that the map of the world in the future is going to be a map with the United States, with China, with maybe Russia looming as a weak player economically, but still a significant strategic and military player, and with the European Union being rather overlooked, ignored, diminished. But there's a great opportunity, especially if the European Union can take the right defenses with regard to its own security, for it to emerge strengthened and more significant. But certainly the European Union faces the clear challenge. It's 27 countries together in a single union. And as you pointed out, there's a range of political positions and political opinions among those 27. You have countries like Hungary, which are clear in stating that they are proud to be an illiberal democracy, to have a political and a cultural agenda that's quite different from the mainstream of the European Union. And with the European Union's institutional setup, where key decisions on military and foreign policy affairs required unanimity, just one country can put a spoke in the wheels of that process. And Hungary is maybe the most prominent country that's slightly at odds with the mainstream consensus. But there's other countries that, have a somewhat sympathetic view to some of the positions adopted by the current Hungarian government. So that is a challenge, and innovative solutions are trying to be found to work around that reality. But it's something that is constantly occupying the minds of the politicians in Europe.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the minds of politicians right now. Friends out there, I'm speaking with Andrew Standley, if you're just joining us, and he will be joining us in West Marin on Friday, May the 7th, as part of a fireside chat with the Music and Minds organization. You can get more information at musicandminds.org and pick up tickets as well. I don't want to give away too much of what you'll be speaking of, although there's so much to talk about here. I'm sure we won't run out, certainly. But I'd love to ask you a few more questions about your time as a diplomat from sort of an emotional perspective, even if you like. I'm curious if there's something that the public might not realize about how diplomats process or adapt to abrupt changes in leadership style, like what we're seeing in the U.S. I mean, as you mentioned before, Trump often would do something like question the value of NATO or the EU in general during his campaign. And I think a big question on the table is how seriously European diplomats took those statements at the time, how we are adjusting to them now. But just from the human side of diplomacy, what is a moment like this like for people in your field?
Well, in a way, it's a very exciting moment. I mean, from a professional point of view, having to confront radically changed situations, which in turn then requires the need for new kind of thinking, new approaches. I think one of the challenges which Europeans, from from my contacts and what I'm reading, the challenges that they're facing in terms of the evolving U.S. EU relationship is really identifying who are the key people around the president. I mean, it's quite clear now that this administration in Washington is remarkable for the absolute centrality of the president, the power, and the way that no decisions are taken without his direct input and approval. But at the same time, the president has advisors around him, members of his cabinet, but it's always a challenge, I think, for people in Brussels, in the European Union, really to find out who are the key players in the executive branch, in the White House, but also in the new Congress, people who really have influence and people maybe who are able to see one or two steps ahead. Because as you said, President Trump often makes an announcement, but as part of a move towards maybe trying to set a deal up in place, but that requires the ability to anticipate where he's intending to go. And sometimes, I mean, it's difficult to ask the president himself directly what he's thinking, what his next moves on the chessboard are. But if you can identify the people who are really close to him, influential, and who understand his thinking, then that really helps you define your own position and your own responses. But that seems to be still a bit of a challenge for people in Europe. And at the same time, I think the mood in Washington at the moment is to deal with European countries on an individual basis. There's very little sympathy for the idea of the European Union in the current administration. We heard that from Vice President Vance's comments at the Munich Security Conference a couple of months ago, where there have been some comments that have been seen in Europe as almost derogatory about the European Union and its significance. And so that leads Washington to want to deal directly with, let's say, the Prime Minister of Italy, or with the President of France, rather than with the European Union as a central body. And when it comes to trade issues in particular, Washington has to understand that trade policy in the European Union is determined centrally by the European Union in Brussels, in consultation with the 27 member states, but it is a highly centralized process. And therefore, the idea of, let's say, the Prime Minister of Italy coming to Washington, as she did just a day or two ago, and maybe embarking on some sort of discussions about trade, that has to be understood that she cannot commit the European Union in that process. It's done in a completely different way. But so I think that's an area where EU diplomats are having to struggle with the fact that they are proud to be part of the European Union. They know how important the European Union is to the functioning of Europe. but they're slightly uncomfortable with the fact that Washington doesn't have a great deal of sympathy with the idea of the European Union.
Hmm. I've even heard some go as far to say that they are approaching this moment in terms of partnerships with, let's say, Mexico or other Latin American countries as one of in which we are witnessing a vacuum in U.S. leadership, just because it's so hard to know what's happening, what or how the U.S. will behave in terms of
Mhm.
partnerships and agreements. Would you say does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, it would resonate since I did work in Mexico. From what I can see, the new president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, has been very effective so far in having a very calm and, in a way, almost patient but also constructive attitude in terms of how to manage the U.S.-Mexico relationship. Um, and I think it's important not to get too overexcited. I mean, some of the pronouncements coming out and some of the decisions coming out of Washington appear disturbing to some people, but at the same time, I think it's important to have a measured kind of response to see how this unfolds, because also domestic US politics are very complex. And on some of these issues of tariffs, we also have no clarity as to what the final legal determination will be. I mean, the US government, there are lawsuits in the courts now attacking the very notion that the president has the authority to increase tariffs in the way that he does. So I think it's important also to engage, to follow very closely, but also just to keep a step or half a step back in order to allow space for the situation to evolve.
Hmm. What if you were, let's say, to advise a new diplomat who's just entering some kind of situation in this particular geopolitical climate, what would you tell them to watch out for coming up? What, based on your experience, what are some things to look for?
Well, I mean, this is a very fascinating moment. The tectonic shifts that are taking place now in global power distribution, both security power and economic power, are rapid and profound. So I think a great deal of flexibility is going to be required, a great deal of imagination to try and come up with the new structures and the new alliances that will allow for stability and at the same time for mutually beneficial economic engagement to take place as broadly as possible. So this is a new era that's opening up. I mean, the world now in 2025 is quite different from what it was 5 years ago, let alone 20, 25 years ago. Again, I mean, going back, if I was talking, giving advice to a European diplomat, I mean, there has to be a realization that there's a danger of Europe being left behind. Europe has to take concrete steps to reconfirm its relevance on the global stage. And that's going to require, I think, perhaps unfortunately in the minds of many, because Europe always prided itself on being a soft power, a non-military power. But the European Union is probably going to have to reinvent itself, certainly with a stiffer military resolve and capacity than it has been in the past.
What gives you hope about the future of EU US cooperation?
I think that, I mean, the fundamental hope lies in the fact that at the end of the day, political and social values in the EU and the US have far more in common than they have in terms of differences. We are still the United States and Europe, and I'm using the word Europe rather than European Union because I want to include countries like the United Kingdom, Norway, Switzerland, which, even if they're not part of the European Union, share these common political, social, cultural values. So Europe and the US are the great repositories of what we can still consider to be, I was going to say, liberal democracy. I know some people don't like the word liberal democracy, but still countries which represent the embodiment of democracy at work. Obviously, Canada, Australia, and a number of other countries also, but the real deep alliance that exists in this democratic world is the transatlantic alliance. And so I'm hopeful that leaders both in Europe and in the US will see that it's in the long-term interest on both shores of the Atlantic to maintain that close relationship, because it is a relationship that's not only based on common economic and commercial interests, but on political and cultural values that have evolved side by side over the last 200 or 300 years.
Yeah. I think that's a really well articulated there. And yeah, I often am thinking about the problems that we share as a species, really, as a species of humans on a planet. And I think there's an increasing awareness of not only our interconnectedness, but the need for alliances and need for cooperation. Not to sound too Pollyanna about things, but I think it seems clear to me. My 6-year-old son knows it as well as anyone else. We've got to find ways to get along and cooperate. Um, Andrew Standley, I really appreciate you taking time. It's always fascinating to hear your perspective on things, and I know we've just barely scratched the surface. But if this conversation has piqued the interest of any of our listeners out there, again, you can come up to the Inverness Ridge on Friday, May the 9th for a fireside chat. That's 4 p.m. And you can get more information at musicandminds.org. There's so much